Story number 1. When you're navigating an 18-wheeler down a 6% grade in the Rockies during a flash storm, your world shrinks down to about 50 feet of visibility. It was right around 2 in the morning on Colorado. State Highway 141, a brutal, twisting stretch carved directly into the sheer canyon walls. I was solo hauling a 65,000-pound load of industrial drill bits and mining equipment, trying to clear the mountain pass before the weather completely shut down the roads. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight, turning the steep, rocky slopes above me into a liquid nightmare. The sheer exhaustion was a physical weight on my shoulders. On these narrow mountain passes, there are no shoulders, no guardrails in the tightest corners, and one wrong move means your rig goes over a 1,000-foot drop. My eyes burned from staring into the blinding sheets of sleet, watching for road, gators of shattered truck tires or stray boulders that had rolled down from the cliffs. I was white-knuckling the steering wheel, my muscles locked tight, desperately looking for the next runaway, truck ramp or isolated chain-up turnout just to get off the active road before my brakes overheated or my traction gave out completely. Through the swirling sleet, I finally spotted a crude, unlit dirt turnout cut into the base of a massive granite cliff face. It was a dark, lonely notch used by state highway crews to store gravel, completely hidden from the main road by a sharp bend in the canyon. I pulled my rig into the mud, the heavy dual tires sinking slightly into the soft, wet earth. I set the air brakes with a loud, echoing hiss, but left the diesel engine idling. If the temperature dropped any lower, I couldn't risk the fuel lines gelling up out here in the middle of nowhere. The moment the cab stopped moving, an oppressive, heavy silence settled over the canyon. There wasn't another headlight's beam for miles. The only sound was the furious, rhythmic slap of my wipers in the deep, unsettling thud, thud, thud of fist-sized rocks, occasionally breaking off the cliff face and smashing into the mud nearby. I needed to check my airlines and ensure the soft mud wasn't going to trap my trailer tandems. So I grabbed my heavy Maglite flashlight and threw open the driver's side door. The freezing mountain wind hit me like a physical blow, carrying the sharp metallic scent of wet slate and pine. I stepped down onto the muddy ground, the cold water soaking through my work boots instantly. I walked along the driver's side of the trailer, aiming my flashlight beam at the steep, rock wall that towered hundreds of feet, directly above my truck. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run instantly, colder than the sleet. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the regular tumbling of small stones. It was a deep, rhythmic, mechanical grinding sound coming from the darkness higher up the mountain slope. I stopped right by my trailer tires, holding my breath, and aimed the powerful beam of light up into the pitch-black canyon. The rain was washing down the cliff face in thick, muddy sheets, but as the light caught a ledge about 50 feet up, my heart stopped. There were footprints up there on the steep ledge, fresh, heavy boot prints cut deep into the mud, completely unbothered by the rain. And right next to them were several bright yellow, industrial-grade hydraulic wedges driven deep into a massive, fractured seam of the granite cliff, directly overlooking the turnout where my truck was parked. This wasn't a natural rock slide in progress. Someone was actively using heavy machinery to force a massive, multi-ton section of the mountain to collapse. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I realized the terrifying truth. I backed up toward my cab, my eyes scanning the darkness. Then the flashlight beam caught a parked, unlit heavy-duty pickup truck, hidden behind a cluster of boulders at the far end of the turnout. The tailgate was down, and the back was loaded with specialized communication jamming equipment and heavy iron crowbars. On the driver's side door of the pickup was a crude, painted logo belonging to a notorious highway cargo ring that had been hijacking supply lines across the Rockies by staging accidental mountain landslides to trap high-value rigs. Panic took over. I wasn't dealing with a natural disaster. I was caught in a coordinated, highly professional ambush. I turned to bolt back to my cab, but a harsh, blinding spotlight suddenly erupted from the top of the cliff ledge, pinning me in its beam. "Drop the light and stay where you are," a gruff, echoing voice shouted down through a megaphone over the roar of the wind. "You're not going anywhere, driver. We just want the cargo." From the shadows near the hidden pickup, 2 men in tactical gear and heavy winter coats stepped out into the mud, aiming high-powered rifles directly at my chest. At that exact second, a sound like a lightning strike exploded from high above. The hydraulic wedges had finished their work, The main structural seam of the granite cliff fractured completely, and thousands of tons of boulders, mud, and ancient pine trees began to cascade down the mountain straight toward the turnout. The hijackers hadn't calculated the sheer volume of the slide. The entire mountainside was coming down, not just onto the road, but onto them. The two men fired a frantic, blind volley of shots toward my truck as they turned to run for their own vehicle, the bullets shattering my passenger side mirror into a spray of chrome and glass. I didn't think. I lunged forward through the deep mud, grabbed the chrome handle of my driver's side door, and hauled myself into the seat, just as the first wave of falling shale slammed into the roof of my sleeper berth with a deafening, metallic roar. The windshield was suddenly covered in a thick sheet of cascading mud. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the hijacker's pickup truck completely crushed under a massive 20-ton boulder, its headlights instantly snuffed out. The mountain was burying everything in sight, and my 65,000-pound rig was directly in the impact zone. I smashed the parking brake valves, threw the transmission into its lowest gear, and stomped the accelerator to the floorboards. The Freightliner screamed, the massive dual tires spinning wildly in the deep mud, throwing up a massive plume of black earth. For a terrifying 2 seconds, the truck didn't move, the sheer weight of the sliding rock pressing against the trailer was anchoring us to the spot. But then the tires bit into the underlying gravel. The rig launched forward just as a massive wall of earth and boulders slammed into the space where my cab had been parked. A heartbeat before, completely crushing the concrete barriers and wiping out the entire turnout. I steered blindly through the mud and falling debris, blowing through the exit of the turnout, and throwing the truck out onto the main canyon highway. The trailer fishtailed violently on the slick asphalt, but I managed to keep the rubber side down, pushing the heavy semi down the mountain road at a dangerous speed until I finally reached a well-lit highway patrol, stationed 20 miles down the canyon. The state troopers and mountain rescue teams went back at daybreak. They found Highway 141 completely blocked by a massive 100-foot wall of solid rock and earth. Beneath the debris, they recovered the flattened remains of the hijacker's pickup, along with the bodies of the two men who had been operating the hydraulic pumps. The rest of the gang was arrested a week later at a warehouse in Grand Junction. I still haul freight through the Rockies, but I never stop in the unlit canyon notches anymore, because I know that out here in the peaks, when the mountain starts to move, it isn't always nature doing the pushing. Story number 2. When a whiteout blizzard hits you at 11,000 feet on Loveland Pass, you don't worry about making your delivery time anymore. You worry about freezing to death in your cab. It was mid-January, right around 1:45 a.m., and the temperature had plummeted to a brutal 30 below zero. I was running a solo route, hauling 45,000 pounds of temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals that needed to stay at a precise 60 degrees, or the entire multi-million-dollar cargo would be ruined. The snow was falling so fast and thick that my high beams were completely useless, reflecting a wall of pure, blinding white right back into my eyes. The road surface was completely gone, buried under 2 feet of unplowed drifts. The only way I knew I was still on the asphalt was the slight vibration of the tires against the rumble strips. If I veered just 3 feet to the left, I'd hit a solid rock wall, 3 feet to the right, and the truck would plunge off a sheer, unprotected cliffside. My hands were cramping from gripping the wheel, and the cold was slowly seeping through the cab's insulation, making my feet numb. I needed to find a safe pull-off pocket immediately, to wait out the worst of the storm before the mountain took me. Ahead, a single, reflective orange marker pole indicated a wide avalanche shelter turnout, a concrete-roofed overhang built into the side of the mountain to let trucks chain up safely during severe winter weather. I guided the long Kenworth into the sheltered pocket, the heavy tires crunching deeply through the fresh powder, before coming to a stop beneath the solid concrete roof. I set the air brakes, the sharp hiss instantly muffled by the heavy snow outside. The relief was incredible, but it lasted only a few seconds. The howling wind outside the shelter was deafening, a low, ghostly roar that vibrated right through the truck's chassis. There were no other drivers here. The shelter was completely dark, illuminated only by the soft green glow of my dashboard instruments and the rhythmic amber flash of my emergency lights reflecting off the frozen concrete walls. I pulled my heavy winter gloves on and grabbed my flashlight, intending to check the refrigeration unit on the trailer to make sure the fuel lines hadn't frozen up in the sub-zero temperatures. I cracked the driver's side door, and a blast of Arctic air filled the cab, instantly freezing the breath in my lungs. I climbed down onto the snow-covered concrete floor of the shelter, the wind screaming violently just 5 feet away past the edge of the roof overhang. I walked to the back of the rig, the flashlight beam cutting through the swirling ice crystals. The reefer unit was humming along perfectly, its green status light glowing in the dark. But as I turned to walk back to the cab, the flashlight beam caught something sticking out of a massive frozen snowdrift at the very back of the concrete shelter. It was a bright yellow object, completely out of place in the white darkness. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the drift, and cleared the fresh powder away. It was a high-end, heavy-duty emergency avalanche transceiver, its digital screen still flashing a low battery warning signal. I picked up the transceiver, my mind racing. These devices are only used by backcountry skiers or state highway crews to locate people buried under snow. I aimed my flashlight further down into the drift, and my heart hammered violently against my ribs. Beneath the fresh snow was the crushed, shattered windshield of a state highway department utility vehicle. The truck hadn't been wrecked by a collision. The entire top of the vehicle had been flattened like a tin can by an immense, concentrated weight. I cleared more snow away from the driver's side door of the buried utility vehicle. Inside, the cabin was empty, but the two-way state radio was still active, static crackling weakly from the frozen speaker. I leaned in, tuning my ear to the faint sound. A frantic, recorded distress message from the highway crew was looping over the airwaves. "Control, this is Unit 4 on Loveland Pass. The cartel hijacked the high-altitude explosive caches. They're triggering artificial slides to trap the gold transport rig. They're using the shelter as a blind spot. If anyone hears this, do not stop at the Mile 10 shelter. They're preparing to drop the entire bowl." A wave of sheer terror washed over me. This wasn't a safe haven. It was a trap set by a professional, highly organized gang of winter-season hijackers who were manipulating the mountain's natural dangers to steal armored cargo. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting across the dark shelter. Standing near the front of my truck were 3 figures wearing white winter camouflage gear and full-face tactical masks. One of them held a heavy military-grade remote detonator switch, while the other 2 aimed automatic rifles straight at my head. "Step away from the truck, driver," the leader shouted, his voice muffled by his mask. "You just drove right into the drop zone. We have 3 charges set on the peak above this roof. In exactly 60 seconds, this entire mountain pocket is getting buried under 50 feet of snow." The hijackers didn't wait for me to comply. The man with the remote smashed the button, and a deafening explosion ripped through the air high above the shelter, shaking the solid concrete roof until dust and ice rain tumbled down onto my truck. The avalanche had been triggered. Millions of tons of hard-packed snow and ice were currently cascading down the peak, a white wall of destruction moving at over 100 miles an hour. The hijackers turned to sprint toward their own snowmobiles parked outside the shelter, completely abandoning me to be buried alive. I didn't think about their guns. I ran for my life, scrambling up the frozen chrome steps of my Kenworth. I dove into the driver's seat just as the sky outside the shelter turned into a solid, terrifying wall of cascading white foam. I slammed the transmission into 3rd gear, dropped the clutch, and stomped the accelerator with everything I had. The 60,000-pound rig screamed, the massive tires tearing through the fresh snowdrifts as the truck launched out from under the concrete roof of the shelter. The timing was down to a fraction of a second. The moment my trailer cleared the concrete overhang, a massive, crushing wave of white snow slammed down behind me, completely filling the shelter and sealing it shut like a tomb. The blast wave of the avalanche hit the rear of my trailer, pushing the heavy truck forward and causing the rear wheels to slide dangerously close to the cliff edge. I fought the steering wheel, keeping the accelerator pinned, plowing blindly through the blinding white powder until the truck finally broke free of the slide zone and blasted out onto the lower, plowed sections of the highway. Through my rear mirror, the Mile 10 shelter had completely disappeared, replaced by a smooth, mountain-sized wall of solid white. I drove straight to the state police headquarters in Silverthorne. The tactical response units and state troopers deployed immediately, capturing the hijackers as they tried to dig out their equipment from the lower slopes. The bodies of the missing highway crew were recovered 2 days later. I still drive the mountain passes, but I never pull into the concrete shelters during a storm anymore, because I know that when the winter wind screams through those mountains, the snow isn't always falling on its own. Story number 3. When you're hauling an 80,000-pound maximum weight rig through the narrow logging passes of the Montana Rockies, you learn to respect the physics of weight and gravity. It was early October, right around 3:15 a.m., and a massive autumn rainstorm had been battering the mountains for 3 days straight, turning the dirt logging roads into a treacherous soup of thick, slick mud. I was running a solo route hauling a heavy, high-priority load of raw timber logs down from a high-altitude lumber camp, heading for a mill near Missoula. The sheer physical exhaustion of steering that much unstable weight down a winding, unpaved mountain trail was breaking my body down. The logging pass was narrow, with a vertical rock wall on the left and a terrifying 600-foot drop into a rushing mountain river on the right. The mud was so deep in some sections that my trailer wheels were sliding sideways toward the edge with every sharp curve. I knew that if I didn't pull over to check my trailer tie-down chains and let the air compressor catch up, the logs could shift, pulling the entire rig over the side of the gorge. Up ahead, my headlights illuminated a small, gravel-strewn emergency turnout right before an old, single-lane wooden suspension bridge that spanned the deepest part of the canyon. It was an ancient, state-maintained access point, surrounded by towering pine trees that groaned loudly in the mountain gale. I rolled the long Peterbilt into the turnout, bringing the heavy rig to a halt just 20 feet from the bridge entrance. I set the parking brakes with a loud pressurized air hiss, leaving the headlights on so the bright halogen beams illuminated the rain-slicked wooden timbers of the bridge ahead. The isolation was absolute. The cell signal had died 40 miles back, and the only light for miles was the yellow glow of my own cab. The air outside was freezing, filled with the terrifying, deafening roar of the swollen river rushing through the gorge far below us. I grabbed my heavy iron cheater bar, the long metal pipe used to tighten load chains, and climbed out of the cab into the freezing downpour. The rain washed over my jacket instantly as I walked down the passenger side of the truck, checking each massive steel chain holding the wall of timber logs in place. Everything looked tight and secure. But as I walked out toward the edge of the turnout to inspect the structural supports of the wooden bridge ahead, my flashlight beam caught something that made my stomach instantly drop. The main concrete anchor block holding the massive steel suspension cables on the right side of the bridge hadn't just cracked. The entire section of the cliff face beneath the concrete foundation had washed away in a massive, silent mudslide. The main cables were completely slack, vibrating under the immense tension of the shifting wind. I stepped closer to the edge of the gorge, aiming my flashlight directly through the driving rain at the wooden support beams beneath the bridge deck. The structure was actively failing. Every few seconds, another massive wooden timber would splinter with a sound like a gunshot, plunging down into the white water far below. The bridge was a death trap. If I had driven my 80,000-pound rig onto those boards, the entire structure would have collapsed instantly, dragging me down into the rocky gorge. I backed up toward my truck, preparing to reverse the long semi back up the mountain trail. But as my flashlight beam cut across the opposite side of the bridge, my breath hitched in my throat. Parked just on the other side of the failing span, completely hidden in the dark woods, was a dark unlit SUV. 2 men in dark raincoats were standing by the bridge, support cables on the far side, holding heavy industrial angle grinders. They had deliberately cut through the safety bolts on the opposite anchor to ensure the bridge would collapse under the weight of the next logging truck that tried to cross. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as the terrifying truth became clear. This wasn't a natural structural failure. It was a planned, cold-blooded execution. A rival lumber syndicate had been sabotage targeting independent owner-operators on this pass to eliminate competition for the Missoula mill contracts. The 2 men saw my flashlight beam cut through the darkness and realized they had been spotted. One of them pulled a heavy black pistol from his coat, stepped onto the swaying bridge, and fired 3 rapid shots across the gorge. The bullets punched cleanly through the fiberglass hood of my Peterbilt, sparking violently against the steel engine block. "Get back in the truck and drive it across," the shooter screamed over the roar of the river. "Drive it over or you die right here in the mud." The force of the snapping cable shook the entire turnout, The wooden bridge tilted violently to a 45-degree angle, the timbers splintering into millions of pieces as the center of the span began to tear away and plunge into the rushing river below. The man who had been shooting lost his footing, his boots slipping on the wet wood as the bridge collapsed beneath him. He let out a short, terrified scream before disappearing down into the absolute darkness of the Whitewater Gorge. The second man on the far side panicked, sprinting back to his SUV, starting the engine, and tearing away into the dark forest trail. But the collapse of the bridge was pulling the rest of the cliffside down with it. The ground beneath my front bumper began to crack and sink, the heavy gravel sliding into the abyss as the mountain edge crumbled. I lunged for the driver's side steps, hauled myself into the seat, and slammed the door shut. The front wheels of the truck were already dipping downward as the mud beneath the front axle gave way entirely. I shoved the transmission into reverse, dumped the clutch, and stomped the gas pedal to the metal floorboards. The 80,000-pound logging rig roared with pure diesel fury, the massive rear duals clawing desperately at the wet gravel of the turnout. For one agonizing second, the truck hung on the brink of the cliff, the heavy front end dipping toward the 600-foot drop. But the raw horsepower of the old Peterbilt won out. The rear tires found traction on the solid bedrock at the back of the turnout, and the massive semi tore backward, pulling itself away from the crumbling edge just as the entire concrete anchor block and the front 20 feet of the road slid completely into the canyon. I backed the long rig 3 miles up the narrow mountain trail in the pitch black until I finally reached a state forestry station with a working landline. The authorities and sheriff's deputies intercepted the surviving saboteur 20 miles away at a roadblock outside Missoula. He confessed to the entire corporate sabotage operation to avoid the death penalty. The bridge site remains completely closed, a raw, empty gap in the mountain trail. I still haul timber through Montana, but I never take the lonely logging passes after dark anymore, because I know that out here in the high woods, some bridges don't just break from the rain, they're broken by men who are waiting to watch you fall. Please subscribe and like the video to support the channel. Thank you.